Did Darwin really discover natural selection? The answer is not exactly. Because more than 25 years before he wrote his famous book, On the Origin of Species, someone else had already described it quite clearly. Here's the version of history most people are taught. Darwin returns home from the voyage of the Beagle in 1836, after visiting places like the Galapagos. He's made many observations that led him to believe in evolution, but he did not know how it worked. He begins seriously thinking about what sorts of forces or mechanisms could cause the biological diversity he saw. By around 1842, he has a working understanding of natural selection. But he doesn't publish. He spends years refining his ideas. He does share his work with his scientific friends, though, many of whom encourage him to publish, but he's timid, for reasons that are still not clear to this day. Then in 1858, Alfred Russel Wallace, doing field work in Indonesia, hit on the same idea during a malarial fever. Keep in mind that at this point in history, many scientists, like Darwin, thought evolution was true. Thus, many people were trying to figure out what causes evolution. Wallace, incidentally, was not new to the field of evolution at this point. He had already founded the field of island biogeography, a subject still studied to this day. I'll leave with that as for a future video, since it's not necessary for our present discussion. The key is that now Wallace had discovered the main mechanism of evolutionary change. He knew it would make him famous. He wrote up his work and sent it back to England for publication. The editors in charge of publication were friends of Darwin's, and they immediately became worried that credit for their friend's life work would go to somebody else. They showed Wallace's paper to Darwin, who immediately recognized it as identical to his own discovery, though considerably less well developed. The editors and Darwin decided to publish both his work and Wallace's at the same time. Technically, Wallace submitted first, and he had a good case for priority. However, there were two things against him. First, many established scientists were familiar with Darwin's ideas and knew that he arrived at them quite a long time ago. It was thus only right that he should at least get equal credit. Second, and this is not part of the official narrative, but it probably played some role, Darwin was a wealthy gentleman. This was Victorian England, remember, and he was part of the good old boy network of science at the time. Wallace was a self-made man who worked his way up from a humble background. He had little clout and probably wouldn't have had much success even if he had pushed for priority. Having said that, there is little evidence that Wallace was unhappy sharing priority or even falling behind Darwin in the years that followed. He recognized Darwin as the senior and more accomplished researcher, which time ultimately made clear. So that is the official story, and it's all true. However, it's not the whole story, because in 1831, 11 years before Darwin's first written sketch, a Scottish writer named Patrick Matthew described natural selection. Patrick Matthew was a merchant with interests in forestry and horticulture. He was a minor authority in these areas, but not widely known. He published one book, Naval Timber and Arboriculture. Today that sounds obscure, but at the time it wasn't trivial. The Royal Navy was the foundation of British global power, and shipbuilding depended on oak. Understanding how to grow and manage timber was therefore a serious and practical concern. Even so, Matthew's book did not become widely influential. In 1860, a year after Darwin published The Origin of Species, Matthew wrote to the Gardener's Chronicle, a popular magazine of the day, claiming priority. He was frankly somewhat indignant. Here is part of what he wrote. Mr. Darwin proposes to have discovered the existence and modus operandi of the natural law of selection, that is, the power in nature which takes the place of man and performs a selection. This discovery, recently published as the results of 20 years' investigation and reflection by Mr. Darwin, turns out to be what I published very fully and brought to apply practically to forestry in my work, Naval Timber and Arboriculture, published as far back as January 1st, 1831. Before we explore Matthew's claims, let's briefly review what natural selection is. In a nutshell, natural selection has three components: variation, differential reproductive success, and heritability. When these three factors are in place, you get evolution by natural selection. Consider a population of harmful bacteria. We want to eliminate them, so we find an antibiotic that kills them. Now, initially, the bacteria are not all the same. They vary in the genes they carry, and some of these genes provide a defense against the antibiotic. In this graph, bacteria with different genes are color-coded, and the resistant ones are red. Initially, antibiotic resistance genes are rare, but every time the antibiotic is used, non-resistant bacteria die in greater numbers than the resistant ones. The result is that each new generation of bacteria contains a higher proportion of resistant individuals. In review, we have variation in the genes conferring resistance. We have heritability, since when the bacteria reproduce, they produce offspring like themselves, and we have differential reproductive success caused by the action of the antibiotic. After many generations, we go from a population of mostly non-resistant bacteria to one that is strongly resistant. Now let's look at what Matthew actually wrote in 1831. His writing is dense and frankly not very clear, but it's important to hear it directly. We'll stick to 2 quotes, but you should know that the ideas are developed further in the book. Here's the first quote, in which he is talking about natural selection. "There is a law universal in nature tending to render every reproductive being the best possibly suited to its condition. Those individuals who possess not the requisite strength, swiftness, hardihood, or cunning fall prematurely without reproducing, their place being occupied by the more perfect of their own kind." Here is the second quote, in which he links natural selection to the fossil record. "Living things may have gradually accommodated themselves to the variations of the elements containing them, and without new creation, have presented the diverging, changeable phenomena of past and present organized existence." I believe that Matthew had the 3 components of natural selection, and he linked them to the diversity of the fossil record. However, it's hard for you to know for sure based on these short snippets. Fortunately, we do not have to argue about whether Matthew got natural selection right, because Darwin himself admitted that he did. Here is part of Darwin's response to Matthew's letter. "I freely acknowledge that Mr. Matthew has anticipated by many years the explanation I have offered of the origin of species under the name of natural selection. Moreover, in later editions of The Origin of Species, Darwin added this line: Matthew gives precisely the same view on the origin of species as that given in the present volume." Darwin did not stop there, though. Here is the rest of what he said. "I think that no one will feel surprised that neither I nor apparently any other naturalist had heard of Mr. Matthew's views, considering how briefly they are given, and that they appeared in the appendix to a work on naval timber and arboriculture. I can do no more than offer my apologies to Mr. Matthew for my entire ignorance of his publication. If another edition of my work is called for, I will insert a notice to the foregoing effect," which we saw that he did. Now let's get to the key point. Darwin said that Matthew's ideas were buried in a place where few likely saw them. They were further not developed sufficiently to convince the public or the scientific community. In short, Matthew's work had no impact. So what can we make of this? Strictly speaking, Charles Darwin did not discover natural selection. Patrick Matthew did. Darwin got credit for the discovery after he independently rediscovered it. The scientific community agreed with Darwin that Matthew's work was published in too obscure a manner and that he did not do enough to champion his idea. Hence, he didn't deserve credit. There have been some attempts to argue that Darwin, and Wallace in fact, did read Matthew's work and stole it. You can Google this topic if you like. I find these arguments to be weak, so I won't go over them here. There is no evidence that Darwin or Wallace ever saw Matthew's work. The idea that Darwin was guilty of science's greatest fraud is far-fetched in my opinion. A key question is whether this story is a curiosity or a common occurrence in the history of science. I think it is somewhere in the middle. We have all heard of the story of Gregor Mendel, the father of genetics, for example. His work was also obscure and published many decades before it was rediscovered, yet he got credit. Of course, Mendel advocated more than Matthew did, and he fully appreciated the importance of his work, so the stories are only moderately similar. Nevertheless, why did he get credit but not Matthew? This is a long story in itself, so I'll save it for a future video. Let's conclude with a take-home message for this story. It often happens that someone makes a discovery, but it goes unrecognized and is ultimately forgotten. Sometimes they don't appreciate the importance of their discovery, like Matthew, but sometimes they do and are just unsuccessful at convincing the community of their work's importance. In such cases, the person who rediscovered the work usually gets most, if not all, the credit, since the original work had no impact, and the later researcher is the one who actually changed the field. In short, it's not enough to get the right idea, you have to prove it to the scientific community. The final question is whether this is right or wrong. Should precedents be strictly observed no matter what? It's subjective. Scientific conventions are really just cultural norms, or traditions. They are not objective, true reality. You have to decide for yourself whether you agree with how it's done. Well, that's it. If you found this story interesting, then like and subscribe to support the channel. Thanks for watching. See you next time.